When a beer can becomes the symbol of a trade war and a pickup truck carries the burden of an entire economy, you know North America is no longer at peace. In just a few days, the tariff showdown between the US and Canada has exploded exponentially. 50% steel tariffs, $22 billion in goods, soaring vehicle prices, and a struggling EV industry. But this is not just a simple act of retaliation. Prime Minister Mark Carney is turning crisis into opportunity, reshaping the entire continental steel-aluminum supply chain. The question is no longer who struck first, but who will fall before the metal cools. The first blow. There were no gunshots, no military convoys, but the war still broke out. Right at the negotiating table between two nations once proud of having the strongest trade alliance in the Western world. When Donald Trump signed the order imposing a 50% tariff on Canadian steel and aluminum, he wasn't just targeting raw materials, he was aiming straight at the structure, at trust, at the value chain, and at the resilience of an economy across the border. And just like every other time, he didn't act quietly. The sanctions were posted publicly on social media, accompanied by a hardline message directed squarely at Prime Minister Mark Carney: play by my rules or pay the price. Carney didn't take more than 48 hours to hit back. No cries for help, no request for an extension. He signed the retaliatory order, not with promises or emotional statements, but with a precise number: $22 billion worth of American goods. Exactly the same figure the U.S. had targeted Canada with. But the scariest part wasn't the tariff rate, it was the speed. North America's trade network, built on the logic of integration, trust, and seamless flow, was suddenly brought to a screeching halt, like a cold surgical cut. The result? Within the first week, EV factories in Michigan were thrown into disarray. EV motors didn't arrive. Pickup frames stalled, and the aluminum sheets used for beer cans, something seemingly trivial, became the first sign that this blow had reached all the way into American refrigerators. The irony? Trump called it a strike to protect domestic industry. But if it was a hammer, it was slamming the very fingers of American blacksmiths. For over 30 years, more than 90% of the steel and 50% of the aluminum consumed by American companies came from Canada. The metal that crossed the border every day wasn't just raw material. It was the heartbeat of a deeply intertwined industrial ecosystem. And this sudden tariff hike was like putting a pacemaker into shock mode. Everything jolted in panic. No one felt the consequences more clearly than automakers. Ford, GM, Tesla, all depended on Canadian steel not just for price, but for stability and quality. One substandard steel slab, one aluminum coil arriving 48 hours late, could cost global assembly lines millions in delayed deliveries. But this time, the damage wasn't about speed, it was about trust. No one knew whether they'd still be exempt from tariffs the next morning or be punished for a tweet posted overnight. To analysts, this was no longer a temporary retaliation. It was the sign of a shifting relationship model. Trump wasn't just targeting Canadian goods, he was targeting the entire trade architecture built since NAFTA, reinforced by USMCA. In the old model, supply chains were optimized across borders, where materials from Quebec could take shape in Ohio, then return to Toronto as finished products. But with this new approach, using tariffs as weapons, the whole logic of cooperate to win together was being twisted into pressure to take more. And when a model gets twisted, it doesn't just bend on paper, it bends in reality. In just 3 trading days, the price of imported EV motors into the U.S. rose 12%. Aluminum for beer cans surpassed $3,500 per ton, the highest since 2022. Beverage companies like Ball, Crown, and Modelo issued warnings. There would be no summer discounts. Consumers would feel the first impact, not in factories, but in supermarkets, at the one place where frustration burns fastest. The grocery bill. From a geopolitical perspective, this tariff may have seemed like testing the waters, but for Canada, it was a red line. Carney didn't respond with soft diplomacy like in the past. Instead of merely calling for more negotiations, he struck back with an equal blow, because if you don't make your line clear from the start, then the model of a bilateral partnership becomes nothing more than a cover for one-sided coercion. Trade wars don't start with tanks. They start with invoices. And in this latest confrontation between Washington and Ottawa, every new tariff line isn't just a number. It's a brick pulled from the foundation of a long-standing alliance. And once the first brick falls, the question is no longer who's right, but how many more floors will collapse. The shockwave from supermarket to assembly line. The impact of a trade decree rarely stops at the borders of the issuing country. But with the 50% tariff launched by the White House, the consequences didn't just cross borders. They shot straight through the supply chain, through corporate pricing sheets, and ultimately into the wallets of every American consumer. No need to wait for a quarterly report. Just a few trading sessions later, everything had changed, and changed price. In Chicago, the cold-rolled steel index spiked as if someone had flipped a panic switch. Each ton of steel, a core material for pickup frames and EV shells, jumped $60, hitting $1,600 per ton, the highest since mid-2022. In the world of industrial materials, that's a shock. But it wasn't the biggest quake yet. The truly alarming moment happened in a much smaller corner. Beer cans. Thin rolled aluminum, typically just mentioned in the packaging industry, suddenly became the epicenter of a pricing crisis. In just 3 days, Midwest aluminum premium jumped 54% to 58 cents per pound, equivalent to over $1,270 per ton. And when major beverage companies like Ball, Crown, and Modelo simultaneously announced that they could no longer maintain summer promotional prices, it was no longer an internal manufacturing issue. It was a slap in the face of American consumers during the peak of summer and an election season. There's nothing random about beer cans becoming the first symbol of this tariff war. Beer, seemingly just a consumer habit, is actually a barometer of basic material costs. Each can combines aluminum, water, CO2, cold supply chains, and nationwide distribution networks. When the price of a can rises, it doesn't just annoy beer drinkers. It signals a second wave of inflation forming, right in the products most familiar and seemingly stable. However, beer was just the opening act. The real punch landed in Detroit, where pickups from Ford, GM, and Ram were once icons of American industry. According to J.D. Power, Ford's new labor contract alone added $850 per vehicle in the F-Series, not including steel and aluminum tariffs. Combined, a pickup truck could rise as much as $8,000 per unit. That's not a hit to margins, that's a survival issue. Bitterly, according to models from Anderson Economic Group, the U.S. auto industry alone has had to swallow over 70% of the added costs, because if passed entirely to consumers, buyers would walk away instantly. And so, the burden goes nowhere. It sits squarely on the shoulders of American corporations, eroding profit margins and collapsing quarterly financial plans in a matter of weeks. Even deeper is the fallout for the electric vehicle sector. The very arena the Trump administration once hoped would be its strategic card against China. But now, critical materials for batteries, aluminum-coated anodes, copper separator films, and even battery casings are all rising in cost right at U.S. factories like Samsung SDI in Indiana and Michigan. They don't need to release a new price list. Just look at the Q2 earnings reports. Margins are as thin as battery foil, in the company's own words. Ironically, the $7,500 EV incentive from the Inflation Reduction Act, IRA, is now at risk of being wiped out by the very tariff Washington imposed on its own input materials. If steel and aluminum prices stay elevated long enough, the entire green subsidy could be eaten up by production costs, turning the incentive into a reverse tax. Somewhere in the White House, perhaps someone still believes the strategy of forcing Canada to back down is viable. But the market doesn't wait. Within just a week, the domino effect from steel and aluminum tariffs has hit 3 layers: consumers, manufacturers, and the U.S. government's clean energy roadmap. And in this game, no side can claim they didn't see it coming. Everything, from supermarket receipts to Tesla earnings reports, is screaming the same truth. There is no safe haven in this war. And so, from a single line in a tariff document, the consequences have flooded into every corner, from the welding plant in Ohio to the supermarket aisle in Phoenix. This isn't just about cost. This is the true price of a political decision. When the ideal of America first morphs into the looming anxiety of America pays. When the electric vehicle dream becomes a domestic nightmare. While the United States is striving to define itself as the leading flag-bearer of the global electric vehicle revolution, a harsh reality is knocking on the doors of factories in Indiana, Michigan, and Texas. A politically driven tariff twist has struck at the heart of its green technology ambitions. Every assembly line, every rolled aluminum coil, every thin anode layer in a lithium battery, all are now bearing the burden of skyrocketing costs. And if any sector has taken a direct hit from the tariff war with Canada, it is the American EV industry. As the 50% tariff begins seeping into the supply chain, EV manufacturers don't need to wait for quarterly financial reports to feel the risk. On the factory floor itself, costs are rising by the hour. Samsung SDI, a battery supplier to both GM Ultium and Rivian, has just warned that crucial input materials like copper separator films and aluminum-coated anodes are increasing in price at an exponential rate. But the issue isn't just the numbers, the issue is the speed and the point of impact. These components aren't ordered annually, but weekly. And when price lists shift every 3 days, no cost planning model can hold steady. Behind the glossy carbon exterior of every EV lies an intricately engineered machine, and any fluctuation at one link can paralyze the entire assembly line. But this crisis doesn't stem from a shortage of components or technical faults. It stems from a political decision. A tariff imposed on the cleanest, closest source of raw materials to the U.S., Canada. And, as cruel irony would have it, this strike comes just as the U.S. is rushing to implement the IRA, with its $7,500 per vehicle credit, designed to make EVs more accessible to the masses. Yet now, the added cost of aluminum and steel alone is enough to swallow that entire credit. While lawmakers in Washington celebrate that EVs are now more affordable, in the real world, every rolled sheet from Quebec is surging to 1.5 times its previous price. Every carbon steel chassis is piling on hundreds of extra dollars. And when the entirety of a federal incentive is evaporated by a tariff imposed by the same government, it is no longer a policy incentive, but a subsidy nullified right at inception. Tesla hasn't released a new price list. GM Ultium has yet to revise its pricing tables. But internally, all companies know this. If they pass on the full cost to consumers, sales will collapse. If they don't, profits will vanish into thin air. And so, they are forced to choose the least painful path, sacrifice margins to maintain market share. But that choice only buys a few quarters. And when the financial wall is eroded down to its foundation, even companies with market caps in the hundreds of billions will hesitate to launch new production lines. The frightening thing is that this shock isn't just a price fluctuation. It exposes America's strategic weakness in its EV supply chain, particularly its dependence on high-grade materials from Canada. Clean aluminum, hydro-reduced cold-rolled steel, specialized battery alloys, all come from a northern metallurgy ecosystem where 94% of the electricity is hydropowered, and emissions standards rank among the strictest in the world. In a global race where China dominates battery supply chains and Europe competes with carbon border taxes, the U.S. should have leveraged Canada as an irreplaceable strategic ally. Instead, it turned a partner into a target. And the result? The American EV dream, built on incentives and optimism, is now derailing, all because of a single tariff signed in a moment of political fury. And the bitterest part? When everything spirals out of control, the American people, those waiting for their first EV, won't receive a cheaper car. They'll receive a delayed delivery notice, a revised price, or a suggestion to consider a hybrid. And so, what was once described as the future of American industry is now being dragged backward by the very hands that crafted the policy. Not China, not global lithium prices, but a 50% tariff, aimed at Canada, yet piercing straight through the heart of America's electrification ambitions. Now, the latest electric pickup rolling off the Texas line is not just a technological product, but the most vivid evidence of the contradiction between green ideals and short-term protectionist policy. And if Washington doesn't retreat from this move, then every LED on an EV dashboard won't signal progress, but a flashing red warning for the entire national industrial strategy. The Northern Reversal. While Washington remains entangled in price storms and election pressure, just north of the border, a counteroffensive is being prepared at wartime speed. But this isn't a war of tanks. It's one of technology, data, and industrial architecture. Mark Carney isn't just answering a tariff blow. He's rebuilding Canada's steel sector, ton by ton, and megawatt by megawatt of clean electricity. Just 3 weeks after Canada launched a symmetrical tariff strike worth $22 billion, Prime Minister Carney unexpectedly opened a strategic arsenal. The Greensteel Fund worth 4.8 billion Canadian dollars, a figure that stunned financial circles not only for its scale, but for its long-term significance. This is not a temporary bailout to stay afloat. This is a redesign of the entire national metallurgy chain, with the goal not just to survive the tariff war, but to rise and dominate North America's green supply chains. Canada's two largest steel plants, Dofasco in Hamilton and Algoma in Sault Ste. Marie, have received more than $2.2 billion from this fund within just a few weeks. Dofasco began fully dismantling its blast furnaces, switching to hydrogen-fired direct reduction and electric arc furnace technology, a transition that will cut 3 million tons of CO2 per year. Algoma aims to use up to 70% recycled steel, producing decarbonized steel right near the Detroit border, just hours from U.S. EV factories. And the special point: all steel produced under the Greensteel program must carry a carbon passport, a document detailing ore origin, energy source used, CO2 emissions per ton, and even the transportation route. This makes Canada the first country in North America to enforce mandatory emissions transparency standards in metallurgy, a strategic advantage as Europe prepares to implement its Carbon Border Adjustment Mechanism, CBAM, in 2026. But Carney doesn't stop at production. The entire logistics, supply, and export ecosystem is also being reprogrammed. A transport corridor from Labrador, where clean iron ore is extracted, to the ports of Quebec and Halifax, is being standardized to export reduced iron pellets to Japan and South Korea, economies facing severe green material shortages. Canada, once a seller of raw ore and intermediary steel, is now aiming to become the clean metallurgy hub of the democratic world. To observers, what's unfolding is not just a reaction. It's a reconstruction. Canada doesn't merely want to retaliate against Trump. They're using the crisis to leap forward, building a steel-aluminum battery ecosystem so clean that the U.S., if it doesn't withdraw from the conflict soon, will have to reattach itself, in a weaker position than before. Perhaps Trump was right in seeing Canada as a dangerous rival, but what he didn't anticipate was his tariff strike would become the catalyst for a geopolitical-scale industrial transformation. And when the first coils of next-gen steel from Dofasco appear, bearing the label zero-carbon steel made in Canada, the market won't just look at price, it will look at the future. And Canada intends to take the wheel. When retaliation becomes a legal encirclement, a tariff strike can cause a shock, but a siege from three fronts, trade, technology, and law, is the kind of blow that can shake the strategic foundation of an opponent. And that is exactly what Mark Carney is quietly executing. Alongside massive investments reshaping the metallurgy sector, Canada is activating another tactic, no less sharp: a multi-layered legal encirclement internationalizing the tariff war. On March 13th, the Canadian government officially filed a complaint with the World Trade Organization, WTO, case number DS-635, protesting the U.S. decision to unilaterally revoke exemptions and raise tariffs on Canadian steel and aluminum to 50%. Under normal circumstances, this might be seen as a symbolic move, but in a WTO paralyzed since 2019 due to the U.S. blocking judge appointments, Carney's choice to initiate a case has a clearer aim: to send a warning signal to allies facing similar harm. Leaked information from the Ministry of Trade indicates that Canada has shared its entire investigative file with Tokyo and Seoul, two countries that were also slapped with an unexpected 25% steel import tariff by the U.S. on July 8th. Without much discussion, if all three nations file WTO complaints simultaneously in the same month, then even with the arbitration system crippled, the political pressure on Washington will become impossible to ignore. In that context, the legal strike is not only a deterrent, but a quiet invitation to a new alliance, an alliance of clean steel-producing nations, acting transparently, seeking to defend a trade order based on rules rather than the momentary anger of a president in campaign mode. But Carney isn't relying solely on international law. He opened another front, domestic but equally lethal. Starting July 21st, all federal infrastructure contracts in Canada must use domestic steel and aluminum. No exceptions, no negotiations. Moreover, Canada issued an additional technical barrier: a quota on third-country steel imports, aimed at preventing Chinese steel from masquerading as American and slipping through the northern border. This places American manufacturers in a bind. Ford, GM, Tesla, even beverage giants like Modelo and Ball now have to recalculate their supply chain strategy. They can't import components from the U.S. to finish in Canada because those American goods now face a 50% tariff. But if they turn to Canadian suppliers, they must prove the full carbon origin and comply with strict environmental standards that not all U.S. facilities can meet. So, what's the result? The market is forced to pivot, not because of calls for cooperation, but because of economic logic. As costs soar and legal walls tighten, companies have no choice but to reconnect with the Canadian supply chain, where clean steel, hydro-aluminum, and ESG standards are becoming the default. On the surface, this may seem like just an administrative measure, but in essence, it is the strategic trap that Carney has laid beneath the feet of U.S. corporations. Either they stay loyal to a penalized domestic supply and watch profits vanish, or they go through Canada and play by Canada's rules. Trump wanted to use trade to control politics. But now trade itself is striking back, armed with every tool: the WTO lawsuit, the domestic carbon law, and technical barriers. Canada isn't just retaliating with numbers, it's redefining the rules of the game. And Washington, if not careful, will go from being the chessboard master to someone forced to play a game others have already set. Carbon passport, the new power ticket. If in the 20th century power was defined by oil, then in the 21st it will come from the amount of CO2 per ton of steel. And no one understands that better than Mark Carney. Amid the storm of trade wars, while all eyes were still fixed on tariffs and metal price charts, Canada quietly drew a silent weapon with far more lasting impact than any tariff: the carbon passport. It's not just a declaration. This is a digital traceability system detailed down to each ore pellet, indicating which mine the steel came from, what type of energy refined it, whether the furnace used hydrogen or coke coal, and the total greenhouse gas emissions calculated per coil of cold-rolled steel. It is transparency at the infrastructure level, and also a strategic tool allowing Canada to shift from the role of a passive supplier to becoming the coordinator of environmental standards across North America. In a context where Europe is deploying its Carbon Border Adjustment Mechanism, CBAM, and major consumer markets from Japan to South Korea are all aiming for net zero before 2050, steel with a clear carbon passport is no longer just a product. It is the standard required to even participate in the global game. And by implementing this passport several steps ahead of the US, Canada has pulled ahead as a rule setter, no longer a follower. What confounds Washington is not just the novelty of the system, it's that it aligns perfectly with the ESG environmental social governance trend that international investment funds are increasingly tightening. A ton of steel produced in an electric arc furnace in Ontario using low-emission hydropower, accompanied by quantified carbon data, will easily attract financing, orders, and tax incentives, like hundreds of thousands of tons of American steel still reliant on traditional coal-fired technology. No grand declarations, no embargoes, just a set of standards, and Canada has made U.S. steel look problematic in the eyes of international corporations. And if you're a procurement director at Ford or GM, you'll know what that means. Every ton of steel without a clear carbon passport becomes a burden on your ESG report. Conversely, Canadian companies suddenly hold an invisible yet immensely powerful advantage. Clean steel, aluminum, and battery materials become a legally and financially safe choice. Not because they're cheaper, but because they carry less risk. And in a world where capital costs depend on ESG credentials, that's enough to shift entire supply chains. The Carney administration went a step further. All projects funded by the Greensteel Fund must integrate the carbon passport, making the new production ecosystems in Hamilton, Sault Ste. Marie, or Labrador not only clean in engineering terms, but also clean on paper in the eyes of international institutions. They're not just forging metal, they're forging global trust. And so, while Washington is still debating whether to add ESG criteria to government contracts, Canada has already built a full traceability system, delivering products with emissions documentation, and sending a clear message. If you want to do business in the 21st century, prove you're not harming the planet. With the carbon passport, Canada doesn't need to shout. They just need to open the door at the right time and let the world come to them. In this new power game, standards are strength. And when you control the definition of clean, you don't need anyone's permission. You are the one holding the scale. End game on the steel board. At this point, the game is no longer just tit for tat between two North American economies. All the cards are on the table. Tariff rates? carbon dossiers, industrial subsidies, international legal filings. But the game isn't over yet. And in the endgame, what matters most isn't who has more pieces left, but who holds the position that forces the opponent to play by their rules. Mark Carney understands that better than anyone. When he saw Trump play the 50% tariff card right as the U.S. EV industry was still struggling to complete its supply chain, he didn't panic. On the contrary, he accepted the initial blow as an excuse to launch a deeper reconstruction, where the goal was no longer to defend, but to redefine the entire operating logic of North American trade. And now, with all the pieces in place, Carney begins to lock the board. July 21st was chosen as the deadline, not by accident. It is the moment he officially demands Washington de-escalate or accept entry into a second-tier trade war, where tariff levels could rise to 70%, not just for steel and aluminum, but extended to copper, lithium, EV batteries, and even semiconductors. According to analysis from the Bank of Canada, if that scenario unfolds, North America could lose 0.8 percentage points of GDP in just 6 months. That seemingly technical number is in fact a clear political warning. There are no winners in a metal war. Only an economy worn down from within, and a supply chain hollowed out link by link. But for Carney, this is not the time to back down. Because if Canada concedes now, it will forever be trapped in a system where the rules are written across the border. But if they maintain their counteroffensive, not through threats, but through technical standards, carbon passports, industrial funds, and WTO filings, they not only prevent further damage, but begin to establish a post-tariff trade order where Canada is no longer a dependent link, but the nucleus of a clean value chain. That's why the real weapon Carney unleashes now is not a tweet or a decree, it's patience. He doesn't need to rush. He knows that the longer this drags on, pressure from U.S. consumers, from beer can prices to pickup truck costs, will rebound straight back to the White House. When material costs rise so high they neutralize EV incentive programs, when U.S. companies must absorb billions in losses just to keep production lines running, the market itself will be the final voice. And that is Carney's final move: to tighten the board, hold firm on 3 cards: symmetric tariffs, green standards, and international law, and wait for the opponent to tire. If Trump de-escalates, the war ends with dignity. If he escalates further, Canada already has a clean production system, a strategic investment fund, and even the European market waiting to receive Dofasco and Algoma's carbon-free steel. And the bitter truth is, while each new pickup rolling off the line in Texas carries an additional $850 Canadian in material costs, Canada has completed the first phase of its great metallurgical overhaul, ready to export strategic steel to the EU under the protection of CBAM. In the end, all the numbers point to one conclusion: Carney hasn't just played this game well, he's rewriting the rules. And the question now isn't who can endure longer, but who dares to change before their economy catches fire from within.